Hey, I'm Daniel and welcome back to another Elder Scrolls Betrayal of the Second Era video. And today we're doing a skill line breakdown. I'll explain how it works, highlight some common rules mistakes, and share some tips based on official clarification, community knowledge, and my own playtime. Let's go! Alright, so let's talk about the heavy armor skill line today. First of all, this skill line belongs to the warrior constellation, as you can tell by this little icon at the bottom of the reference sheet, which is important for town trainers or certain game effects that specifically refer to this particular icon, because sometimes it's hard to see it, but yeah, this is what it means it's a warrior constellation. This skill line is also associated with stamina as the main stat, as you can tell by this little green icons over here, which means the number of heavy armor dice you can roll in a single engage is limited up to a stamina stat. And also this skill line requires to be in defensive battle form, which means you cannot roll these dice together with pretty much any dice that deal damage, like two-handed or one hand and shield skill line, or some other skill dice that deal damage. And of course you can still combine this with other dice that you can roll in defensive battle form. For example, you can combine those heavy armor dice with a basic combat dice if you roll them, but then this combat dice, it won't deal any damage, because when you rolled in defensive battle form you place this in your active slot like that. But for now, let's just get back to the basic of heavy armor. And so the heavy armor skill line is a pretty unique one in a sense that all skill dice from this skill line, they are resolved in your cooldown track, as indicated by this little purple icon with the C letter inside it. And so that means that, let's say, if these are the two dice that you're rolling in, this is the result that you get, you place them in your cooldown track right away, and they provide you some defensive bonuses while sitting in the cooldown track. And so let's talk about the level 1 skill dice, which are Resolve and Constitution. Resolve says, while this die in your cooldown track, when you are dealt damage by an adjacent enemy, you may prevent X damage. And Constitution is pretty much the same, with the only difference that it prevents damage from non-adjacent enemies. So both of these dice, they have two sides with a number 2, just like that, and so that means that it's a pretty decent chance of rolling those sides, somewhere around 30%, and whenever those dice in your cooldown track with those value, it means that how damage you can prevent with each attack. And if you compare it with one hand and shield skill line, or even those basic combat dice when you're sitting here in your active slots, whenever you prevent damage, you then exhaust those dice, place them in your cooldown track, so it's essentially just only one off prevention. But those heavy armor dice, they provide those defensive bonuses and effects while sitting in your cooldown track, regardless of the number of engages or the number of damage. It doesn't reduce to 1. Let's say if you have this resolve die sitting with a number 2, if you are dealt damage, you're not gonna change result to another one, or you're not removing it from your cooldown track. Just as long as it's here, you can prevent that much damage, which definitely makes this whole skill line pretty strong. But of course, when it's start of your turn, you're recovering dice according to your cooldown track value, and then you move those dice out of your cooldown track, and of course you're losing all of your defensive bonuses. So as a general rule of thumb, you want to keep those heavy armor dice in your cooldown track for more turns potentially, so you don't need to roll them every turn. And so ideally you might want to do some damage first. Let's say with this combat dice you can roll them in light weapon or some other battle forms that deal damage, either ranged or heavy weapon. And let's say you dealt damage with those dice first, then you exhaust those dice, then you take in another engage, add in some light fatigue to your cooldown track, you switch battle form to defense, and only then you roll those dice and you place them in your cooldown track. And this way, because you rolled them last, they're gonna sit in your cooldown track longer. Although of course keep in mind that both of those dice, they still have misses, so you can potentially roll both of them like that, which will leave you completely defenseless. This is just something to keep in mind. Now moving on to the level 2, we have two dice, Immovable and Ironclad, and let's talk about Ironclad first. It says, while this die in your cooldown track, Resolve and Constitution dice in your cooldown track each prevent 1 additional damage. So Resolve and Constitution are this level 1 skill dice that we talked about before, and let's say with those particular side they will both prevent 1 damage, but if you add 1 Ironclad to that, it means each of them will prevent 2 damage now. And of course, because both Resolve and Constitution, they have number 2, means that how much damage they can prevent potentially on their own. With Ironclad, they can now prevent up to 3 damage, but because there are 2 copies of each Resolve and Constitution in the supply, it means you can potentially train all of them, and this way you can potentially prevent up to 6 damage from adjacent enemies and up to 6 damage from non-adjacent enemies in total, which will make you pretty much immune to damage altogether. Now, as a little pro tip, whenever you roll those dice together, make sure to place Ironclad in your cooldown track first. So let me just for a moment remove those 2 dice, and let's say those 3 dice that you rolled in a single engage, and because you can choose in the order in which you resolve the dice, just make sure to put Ironclad first, so they would end up in your cooldown track with something like that. And why is that so, you may ask? Well, in this case we have a cooldown value of 2, which means at the start of the turn I'm gonna recover those 2 dice first, then on the next turn we would recover 2 fatigue first, and then on the turn after that we would recover those 2 dice, but resolve will still be sitting here providing some defensive values, some defensive bonuses. But let's say if we would have this Ironclad sitting last, and that means we would recover both resolve and constitution first, which means only one single Ironclad would left in the cooldown track, but remember that it doesn't deal anything on its own. It doesn't give you anything on its own, it doesn't provide any bonuses, it's only kind of buffing up your resolve and constitution dice, so just make sure you always place it first before your resolve and constitution. Now let's talk about the second level 2 skill die, which is Immovable, and it says while this die in your cooldown track, after an adjacent enemy engages you, deal that enemy damage equal to the number of available combat skill dice you have. So first of all, just like as all heavy armor skill dice, this Immovable needs to be in your cooldown track in order to provide some bonuses. Then you need to be engaged by an adjacent enemy, and after that happens, then you can deal damage back to that enemy, which is equal to the number of available combat skill dice you have. And here let's clarify a couple of moments. First of all, that combat skill dice are these white combat skill dice that you're starting with, those basic dice that each character starts with, and only them specifically. And also available skill dice, it means sitting in this attribute row, ready for rolling. So for example, if you have one of those combat dice in your active slot and one of them in the cooldown track, this is not gonna work. You need to keep them available, which means sitting in the attribute row just like that. And in this case, because we have 2 of such dice, we can deal 2 damage back to this Breton Bandit after it engages us. Now for a moment, let's say that instead of this Breton Bandit, we have this enemy called Spriggan. The only thing that this enemy does, it applies Bane, and the question you might have is whether this is considered an engage, and therefore whether this enemy will take some damage back from us with Immovable. And the answer is yes, of course, even though it doesn't deal any damage, the fact that it targets you and resolves some effects, in this case applying Bane, it's still considered an engage, and therefore in this case, this Spriggan enemy would be dealt 2 damage from us from this Immovable. But of course remember that this effect applies only when we engage by adjacent enemies, and let's say if this Spriggan would be 1 hex away, then our Immovable won't work. And so with this Immovable you can go absolutely crazy and potentially train up to 6 basic combat dice, and that means that after each engage you would deal 6 damage back to the enemy, kinda like a passive reflect, as long as you have this Immovable in your cooldown track. Now moving on to the level 3, we have a die called Unstoppable, and while this die in your cooldown track, you may move 1 additional hex for each heavy armor skill die in your cooldown track, and you may move into hexes occupied by non-quest units. When you do, the unit occupying the hex is placed to the closest unoccupied hex. And so let's say we have this Unstoppable in our cooldown track, and that means we may move for 1 additional hex for each heavy armor dice in our cooldown track, which means in this case we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 plus 3 movement from our stamina, so in this case it means we can move up to 8 hexes. And of course remember that Unstoppable counts itself as well, so if you would have just a single Unstoppable die in your cooldown track, that would already count it as plus 1 additional hex. So that is pretty cool and pretty useful, especially in some encounters like Delves. But there is also another pretty unique part in this die, that you may move into hexes occupied by non-quest units. And so let's say while we have this Unstoppable in our cooldown track, we can just completely move onto this Spriggan essentially and move it away and say, hey, get out of the way, just like that. Because remember that in this game you normally cannot move through units, both enemies and allies, of course provided that you don't have any special effects that specifically state that you may move through units. And while with this effect you kinda cannot move through units as well, but you can just move them through your way, and you can push this Spriggan, let's say to this hex, then you move to the same hex and you push it again, so you can move it the way you want it, almost in a way like that. And finally onto level 4 we have Juggernaut, which says while this die in your cooldown track, you may gain 1 light fatigue to gain 2 tenacity each time you change battle form. And so let's say we have this Juggernaut in our cooldown track, and we are currently in defensive battle form, but remember that you can choose your battle form and switch to different battle form in 2 cases. First, if you want to use your class ability that requires a different battle form, you can switch your battle form for the cost of 1 light fatigue. Let's say you change into Magicka, and because you change in your battle form, in this case because we have Juggernaut, you can also add another light fatigue to also gain 2 tenacity. And you can also gain light fatigue every time you make an engage, and there is something a little bit tricky, kinda somewhat borderline exploitable I guess, because remember that whenever you make an engage, rolling dice is optional, and that means you can make essentially kinda empty or fake engages multiple times, just changing battle forms and gaining more fatigue. And in this case, because of Juggernaut, you can essentially just adding as many light fatigue as you want and gain that much tenacity, even without rolling any dice. And of course you would end up with a lot of light fatigue in your cooldown track, especially if you're playing on expert difficulty, because when you're playing on expert, you need to add 2 light fatigue to your cooldown track when you're making an extra engage, plus you add in another light fatigue for this Juggernaut. But again, if you want to, and if you need a lot of tenacity, you can do that. And I guess it could be slightly questionable how much it is okay to just gain in any number of light fatigue on demand essentially, without making any engages, or kind of making empty engages without rolling any dice, but hey, that's kind of within the rules as written. And so what do I think about this skill line as a whole? And I think it is extremely powerful. You can potentially prevent up to 6 damage if you have 2 copies of Resolve in Constitution and Ironclad, and you can move for up to additional 6 hexes with your Unstoppable, and you can deal up to 6 damage back to each enemy after each engage with Immovable, of course provided that you have that many combat dice trained, but it's still possible. And of course you can generate yourself pretty much any amount of tenacity you want with Juggernaut, of course provided that you have enough space in your cooldown track to gain that many light fatigue. But yeah, all of those effects are just crazy strong. And to be honest, for this reason, whenever I play with this skill line, I try to be kind of cautious and not to go too crazy with this, and generally speaking, I prefer to train just a single Constitution, a single Resolve, and a single Ironclad. I think in most cases this is enough to provide some a little bit more survivability and just generally staying alive, especially when you're playing true solo. This definitely helps, but of course if you want to get absolutely ridiculously powerful and preventing all of the damage, or just moving around like crazy, pushing all of those enemies, you can totally do that. This skill line is seriously borderline OP, but nevertheless it's still pretty fun. And that's it for this breakdown. If you found it helpful, feel free to give it a like and subscribe, this really helps the channel grow. And if you would like to support what I'm doing more directly, you can do this over on Patreon, and I would appreciate this a lot as well. And well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.